I recess at any time. I'm going to acknowledge myself for my introductory statement. The Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS, is a mandatory minimum of biofuels that must be used in the national transportation fuel supply. The program was first established by Congress in 2005 and was later expanded in 2007 under the Energy Independence and Security Act to mandate that 36 billion gallons of biofuels must be blended into the fuel supply by 2022. The original goals of the RFS were to help curb air pollution, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and increase U.S. energy independence through the use of biofuels. Much has changed since the first 10 years that RFS has been in effect. When the original laws were passed, Americans had serious concerns about the rising price of gas and about our dependence on foreign oil. However, since almost immediately after the law was passed, the U.S. has experienced an extraordinary energy supply boom. Today, gasoline is selling for historically low prices. The assumption under the RFS that demand for oil would continue to rise has not been realized, and we must take a hard look at how this affects the success of the program. Unfortunately, the way the law was written makes it incapable of adequately adjusting to these changes. The EPA is responsible for developing and implementing regulations for the RFS, but due to the challenging reality the RFS operates in, EPA has continually been late in issuing its renewable fuel obligation levels and has often had to issue these annual renewable fuel mandates retroactively. This past November, EPA issued the final renewable fuel volume levels for the year 2014, 2015, and 2016. This would make 2016 one of the few years EPA has issued that mandate on time. In addition, EPA has often elected to use its waiver authority to issue volume mandates that are below the level set by law, further showing how the original mandates are unsustainable in today's reality. The current RFS mandates have caused the nation's fuel supply to reach the blend wall of 10% ethanol incorporated into the fuel supply. This blend wall barrier is the highest level of ethanol blended into fuel that can be sustained in the current American automobile market. If any percentage higher than this is used in vehicles, serious engine problems can occur in older cars or void warranties in newer models. This creates a serious problem for consumers. The implementation of the RFS has also created some unintended and adverse consequences. The rapid expansion of biofuel production using corn has caused an increase in food prices, which in turn hurts the poorest and most vulnerable in our society, both at home and abroad. Furthermore, some studies have shown that current ethanol production may actually contribute to higher greenhouse gas emissions. Accordingly, in a 2011 National Academy of Science study, EPA's own emissions analysts found corn ethanol to have a higher life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than that of gasoline. This is in direct contrast with the original RFS goal of improving air quality. These are just some of the problems that must be addressed as we examine the effectiveness and viability of the RFS as a program. Today, we are joined by Mr. Christopher Grundler from the EPA Office of Transportation and Air Quality. I hope that the EPA can help us help you. Tell us what Congress needs to do to make it able to do its job. I also hope to hear about the effects of the RFS from other members of the diverse panel that we have here today. I look forward to having a productive discussion with our witnesses on what we can do to best address the problems in the RFS program. I want to thank you for all taking the time to appear today, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, seeing that the ranking member is not here, I'm going to recognize the Vice Ranking Member, Matt Cartwright, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Dr. Gosar and Chairman Jordan, for holding today's hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for coming today and sharing your expertise with us. Renewable energy and energy efficiency technology play an instrumental role in improving America's energy independence and in reducing carbon emissions. Certainly, renewable energy sources are our future. Congress has to help facilitate and expedite our inevitable transition away from fossil fuels, and the Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, can play an important role in the transition. Established in 2005 and expanded in 2007, the RFS was crafted by Congress to to address our nation's dependence on foreign oil, as well as spark clean energy innovation and job creation. The RFS requires the EPA to issue annual standards on 4 different categories of renewable fuels: total, advanced, biomass-based diesel, and cellulosic. These standards identify the percentage of each biofuel category that producers and importers of gasoline and diesel must blend into transportation fuel, heating fuel, and jet fuel. I hope we can all agree that the goals of the RFS are laudable and deserve all of our support, and the industry has certainly achieved some success in meeting them. Biofuels, and especially advanced biofuels, hold the promise of dramatically reducing the carbon and environmental footprint of our transportation sector. According to the biotech industry, over its 10-year lifespan, the RFS has reduced U.S. transportation-related carbon emissions by 589.33 million metric tons. Moreover, the industry is creating jobs. The cellulosic biofuel industry operates commercial biofuel plants in Kansas, Iowa, Mississippi, and Florida. 20 states have biofuel facilities at different levels of development. However, we do have to acknowledge the growing pains this industry has faced over the past decade, and I do have my own concerns. I have concerns about the RFS's impact on agriculture, food prices, and a series of unintended but potentially serious impacts on our environment. I'm concerned about the RFS's influence on the conversion of forest lands and wetlands to corn and soy fields. And I'm concerned about the different estimates of the carbon footprint of corn ethanol. And I want to understand better what the true current and future climate impact of the RFS will be. Looking forward, I hope that the progress of the biofuels industry, which without the RFS never would have occurred, can lay a foundation for a bright future for renewable fuels. Carbon reductions and environmental benefits have thus far fallen short of the heights we may have hoped for, and cellulosic biofuels have not reached the production levels predicted when the RFS was first established. But despite this, I still see a bright and essential future for renewable fuels, and the RFS is the most important policy tool we have to allow this industry continue to innovate and expand. The biotech industry asserts that cellulosic and advanced biorefineries have now reached commercial status and that additional biorefineries can be built at lower capital costs. I hope that the recent standards announced by EPA can provide certainty and propel us toward the advanced fuels that will truly meet the original goals of the RFS. I hope to work with my colleagues to get over hurdles such as the E10 blend wall and constraints in the supply chains that have limited the industry. Our reliance on fossil fuels to power our transportation sector is unwise and unsustainable, and Congress was smart to provide a path for renewable fuels. The implementation of the RFS has raised valid concerns from many corners, but I believe that the industry is ready to take a major step forward toward the advanced biofuels that will have an important and positive impact on the environment, on jobs, and on the transportation sector. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, better to understand the RFS, and look forward to working with them and my colleagues in laying out a path toward a renewable energy future. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm glad that we also worked on potato. I'd like to recognize Mr. Jordan, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health Care Benefits and Administrative Rules, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you for having this hearing. You know, this would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. This is a classic example of what happens when you get a bunch of politicians together and think they're smarter than the marketplace. A bunch of politicians got together back in 2007 and said, you know what, we think we should blend it at this rate this year and then keep increasing it, and now all of a sudden we've hit the blend wall, where even the EPA says, Mr. Mr. Grundler, who's here to testify today, testified even 3 years ago and said it's not feasible for the system to absorb that much ethanol, right? So instead of letting the hundreds of millions of consumers figure this out and the marketplace figure this out, politicians got together and they said, we're smarter than everybody else and we're gonna put this schedule together. We think this is the way to go, and we're gonna invest taxpayer money and skew the system in a way. This is a classic example of why you shouldn't do that, why you should let the marketplace work. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. I hope our witnesses will just say, we never should have went down this road in the first place, and the best thing we can do is get out of it as quickly as possible. And short of that, maybe there's some other remedy, but this is, again, just a great example of why you don't let a bunch of people in Washington think they're smarter than everybody else start some program that winds up creating all kinds of problems. So with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize Ms. Lawrence, Ranking Member of the Subcommittee on Interior, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar and Chairman Jordan, for holding this hearing today. I also want to thank our witnesses for your time and testimony today. A Republican Congress passed and a Republican president signed into law the Energy Policy Act, which established the Renewable Fuel Standard. The RFS seeks to decrease our nation's dependency on foreign oil, as well as to promote clean energy innovation and job creation. The need for RFS remains as true today as it was in 2005. I'm proud to say that the innovation by Ford Motor Company, headquartered in my home state of Michigan, has sparked tremendous process due to the RFS. For instance, since 2013, vehicles sold by Ford Motor Company in the U.S. are capable of running on gasoline as well as E15 blended ethanol fuel. To date, Ford has manufactured more than 6.4 million flexible fuel vehicles globally. Ford Motor Company's efforts demonstrate tremendous strides in advancing and promoting the use of renewable fuels, creating jobs, and expanding our national economy. In addition, according to the biotechnology industry, the RFS has displaced nearly 1.9 billion barrels of foreign oil over the past decade by replacing petroleum fuel with homegrown biofuels. Although the RFS has experienced challenges, it is not the time to abandon the RFS. We owe it to our constituents of future generations to keep the RFS on track as a means to reduce our carbon emissions and dependence on fossil fuels, and to create jobs building a cleaner energy future. I look forward to working with my colleagues to keeping this important piece of legislation intact. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. I will also hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We will now recognize our panel of witnesses. First, I am pleased to welcome Mr. Christopher Grundler, Director of the Office of Transportation and Air Quality at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Our second guest is Mr. John DeCicco, Ph.D., Research Professor at the University of Michigan Energy Institute. Did I say it right? Ms. Kelly Stone, Policy Analyst at ActionAid USA. Mr. Wallace Tyner, Ph.D., the James and Lois Ackerman Professor at the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. And our final witness is Mr. Nicholas Loris, the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you all. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, witnesses will be sworn before they testify. Will you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. In order to allow for discussion, please limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement will be made part of the record. With that, I would like to recognize Mr. Grundler for 5 minutes.
Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Lawrence, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Cartwright, and other members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity today to testify on the Renewable Fuel Standard Program and the EPA's recent final rule setting the annual volume standards for 2014, 2015, and 2016, as well as the biomass-based diesel volume requirement for 2017. As has been noted, the program began in 2006 under the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and modified by the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, or ISA, which established new annual volume targets for renewable fuel that increase every year to reach a total of 36 billion gallons by 2022. It included 21 billion gallons of advanced biofuels. Congress also included waiver provisions for EPA to use to adjust these statutory targets in specified circumstances, including where the statutorily prescribed volumes could not be met. After an extensive notice and comment process, including working closely with our federal partners at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Energy, EPA finalized regulations to implement the ISA requirements, and those regulations went into effect in July 2010. The law requires EPA to issue annual standards for 4 different categories of renewable fuels, and the Chairman already described these. We also established the applicable volume of biomass-based diesel, commonly referred to as biodiesel, that will be required in 2017. With this final action, we believe the RFS program is back on schedule, and we're determined to keep it on schedule. Biofuel use over the past decade has increased significantly, especially for ethanol and biodiesel, and recently we've seen important developments in the production of advanced renewable fuels, including cellulosic biofuel production. Most of this growth in ISA's renewable fuel targets for 2015 and beyond comes from these advanced cellulosic biofuels. We are committed to continuing to do what we can to encourage and support production and blending of such fuels to maximize reductions in greenhouse gases. The final standards will increase the amount of biofuel in the market beyond historic levels, which is consistent with Congress's intent. The final standards provide for ambitious yet achievable growth and incentivize growth in advanced fuels that achieve substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions compared to the transportation fuels they replace. The rule uses the law's waiver authorities to adjust the annual volume targets, but does so in a judicious way. The final rule addresses 3 years' worth of standards and sets the volume requirement for biomass-based diesel for a 4th year. For 14 and 15, we finalized standards at levels intended to reflect the actual amount of biofuel used domestically. For 2016 and for 2017, for biomass-based diesel, the standards we have finalized provide for increases over past levels. The final 2016 volumes for total and advanced renewable fuels reflect our consideration of 2 essential factors. First, that the market can respond to ambitious volume targets, and second, that today there are limits to the volumes that can be supplied to consumers. The final rule goes into considerable detail why some of the volume targets established in the statute cannot be reached. There are several reasons why, and some have already been mentioned. Slower than expected development of the cellulosic biofuel industry and the resulting shortfall in cellulosic biofuel supply, a decline in gasoline consumption rather than the growth originally projected in 2007, and constraints in supplying certain biofuels to consumers, ethanol at greater than 10% of gasoline in particular. Our final rulemaking includes a discussion of this last constraint, known as the E10 blend wall. If gasoline demand is flat or trends downward, increasing the amount of ethanol used in the fuel pool will require significantly greater use of fuels with higher ethanol content, such as E15 and E85, which can be used in flexible fuel vehicles. However, EPA recognizes that there are real limitations in today's market to the increased use of these higher ethanol content fuels, including current near-term limits on fueling infrastructure. USDA is working to expand this ethanol fueling infrastructure. Overall, the final rule requires that total renewable standards grow by more than 1.8 billion gallons from 2014 to 2016, which is an 11% increase over 2014. The final cellulosic standard is nearly 200 million gallons, or 7 times more than the market produced in 2014, and for advanced biofuel, the 2016 standard is nearly 1 billion gallons, or 35% higher than the actual 2014. In addition, the biodiesel standard also grows steadily over the next several years, reaching 2 billion gallons by 2017. A 23% higher level than the actual 2014 volumes. We believe that these volumes are achievable and consistent with Congress's clear intent to drive renewable fuel up, even as we use the authorities that Congress provided EPA to manage the program responsibly. We've taken other steps to improve the administration of the RFS program. We've improved the petition review process for new pathways under the program, and they're already making a difference. Since launching this new process, we've approved over 50 petitions for more efficient corn ethanol plants with an average review time of less than 2 months. This is an 80% improvement over our prior performance. We've also proposed finalized 6 new pathways for second-generation biofuels and proposed 5 more. Having finalized these standards, as we look towards 2017, it's important to remember that the RFS program is only one part of the overall picture. Both USDA and DOE have programs supporting development and infrastructure, and we work closely with them in our work to implement this program. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today.
Thank you very much. In the spirit of the NCAA tournament, LOSIC is 4, LOSIC is 0. I'd like to now introduce Mr. DeCicco from the University of Michigan.
Thank you. Wish to thank the chairs, Representatives Gosar and Jordan, ranking members, Representatives Lawrence and Cartwright, as well as the other members of your subcommittees and the overall committee who are here today. My name's John DeCicco, and I'm a research professor at the University of Michigan's Energy Institute. My main focus is transportation fuel use and its environmental impact. I have a doctorate in engineering from Princeton University, and I've worked on America's energy challenges for nearly 40 years, including 21 years at environmental organizations before returning to academia in 2009. My research has included scientifically rigorous evaluations of the RFS and other policies that promote biofuels such as ethanol and biodiesel. RFS proponents claim that the policy reduces CO2 emissions. I have found that it does not. In fact, from its inception, the RFS has increased rather than decreased CO2 emissions compared to petroleum fuels such as gasoline. My findings contradict the conventional wisdom about biofuels. They reveal errors in the computer modeling on which the environmental rationale for the RFS was based. It's no surprise that some biofuel researchers and advocates have criticized these findings, and those of other scientists who also have found flaws in the modeling that backs the RFS. The claims that biofuels reduce CO2 emissions rely on a method known as life cycle analysis. It's a way to compare fuels according to their carbon footprint. When it expanded the RFS through ISA in 2007, Congress required EPA to evaluate the life cycle emissions of advanced biofuels. The agency also adapted the method for its RFS impact assessments. EPA did not originate fuel life cycle analysis. Rather, the method was largely developed at the Department of Energy and by academic proponents of renewable energy, and its use was advocated by the green groups who backed the RFS. Unfortunately, life cycle analysis makes a mistake by assuming that biofuels are automatically carbon neutral. Only under certain conditions does replacing a fossil fuel with a biofuel neutralize the CO2 that leaves tailpipes. For that to occur, harvesting the corn or other feedstock must greatly speed up how quickly cropland pulls CO2 from the air. That doesn't happen for the corn and soybean harvests diverted to produce renewable fuels as mandated by the RFS. My analysis looks directly at farm data, and those data show that in practice, the carbon neutrality assumption is not met. My research team evaluated corn ethanol, for which a life cycle analysis study claims a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to gasoline. We found no significant reduction of emissions. Moreover, under typical crop rotations, net emissions could be as much as 70% higher than those of gasoline. These results do not even include indirect land use change, which would increase biofuels' emissions impact even more. So here we are, 10 years after the 2005 energy bill first established the RFS, 8 years after it was expanded by ISA, and the policy has worsened CO2 emissions. It turns out that the studies used to justify it are flawed. Environmentally speaking, it would be best to repeal the Renewable Fuel Standard. Short of that, helpful reforms would include scaling the mandate back to well below the blend wall and striking life cycle analysis from the policy. Thank you for letting me share my findings, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you to the gentleman. I now recognize the gentlewoman, Ms. Stone, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Gosar, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Lawrence and Cartwright, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the Renewable Fuel Standard. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share ActionAid USA's perspective on the RFS and the need for reform. ActionAid is an international organization committed to countering extreme poverty and social injustice. We make long-term commitments to empower the communities that we work with, helping them to identify and address the challenges they face in realizing their human rights and overcoming extreme poverty. ActionAid USA advocates for reform of the RFS because of its impact on food security, land tenure, and water. Mandates for food-based biofuels such as the RFS increase hunger around the world, drive land grabs in developing countries, and divert resources such as water to fuel. First, on food, I want to emphasize to the subcommittee how fundamentally important food security is. Hunger impacts every aspect of development, from health to education and the workforce. Without food security, real development is not possible. One of the primary ways biofuel mandates impact hunger is by increasing food prices. Of course, many factors go into determining the price of food. However, it is widely recognized that food-based biofuels create an upward pressure on food prices. And while prices have dropped from 2012, they are still high compared to historical levels and present real challenges to poor families. Mandates for food-based biofuels impact prices by driving up demand for a particular feedstock. This increase in demand impacts the price not only of that feedstock, but any food that requires that feedstock for production, or feedstocks that can be a substitute. For example, significantly increased demand for corn creates upward pressure on food prices for corn, dairy, because cows eat corn as feed, and for other grain like wheat. If people find corn prices have gone up, they may try to substitute for corn with wheat, but that means demand and prices for wheat have gone up as well. Access to safe and nutritious food often comes down to the ability to pay, so food price is a critical part of food security. Poor families in developing countries often spend a significant amount of their income on food, sometimes as much as 80%. What looks like a small increase to us can be devastating to poor people trying to feed their families. On land, demand for biofuels also drives up demand for land on which to produce those biofuels. This results in small family farmers being forced off their land in developing countries to make way for large biofuel plantations. Instead of producing food for the local community, that land is used to produce fuel for a developed country. ActionAid has worked with communities in Central America, Africa, and Asia who have had their land threatened or taken in this way. I want to emphasize what a loss of land means to these farmers. This is not simply a loss of property for which they can be easily compensated. For smallholder farmers, secure land tenure is crucial to their ability to feed themselves, their families, and their communities. Land is their livelihood, their investment in the future, and in some cases, a part of their cultural identity. That security is not easily replaced. Last May, I met with some family farmers in Mato Grosso, Brazil. They were struggling to grow food because of the biofuel production next door, including the airily sprayed chemicals involved in that production, were hurting their crops. One man's voice in particular stays with me because he did not just talk about the loss of food, but a loss of identity. He had been a farmer his whole life, but now he cannot grow food for his family. It was as if he felt that his identity had been taken from him, as well as his crops. Finally, water, like land, is a finite resource. There is only so much available to a community at any given time for growing and preparing food, drinking, and hygiene needs. Water, as you know, is profoundly important for human survival as well as development. ActionAid USA's research has found that in most cases, expanding biofuel production in countries that the U.S. imports these fuels from results in an increase in water consumption. Even when biofuel crops are rain-fed, that resource is being used to produce fuel for export instead of being used to meet the community's fundamental needs. The RFS is a broken policy that is badly in need of reform. Many in Congress supported the RFS in 2005 and again in 2007 with the best of intentions. However, the evidence is now clear that this is a policy that is not helping the environment and it is doing real harm to people. We need a fundamental shift in our approach to biofuels, and we must end mandates for food-based biofuels, such as corn ethanol. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. I now recognize Dr. Tyner for his 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to share my observations on the Renewable Fuel Standard and its possible impacts. In general, biofuel policies have, and the RFS have had three major objectives. One is to enhance rural incomes, two is to reduce oil imports, three is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. My assessment is that the RFS has been successful in achieving all three of these objectives. As was indicated earlier, the final numbers for the 2014-2016 RFS were released by EPA in November of 2015. Let me review briefly what they said in each of the three major categories. For cellulosic biofuels, basically the decision that EPA made is that they cannot mandate something be blended which doesn't exist. So they've taken a build it and we will come attitude. That is, they estimate the amount of cellulosic biofuel that will be available in the following year, and that becomes the RFS level. For biodiesel, EPA believes the system can absorb much more than the original RFS level. So they set the 2016 level at 1.9 billion gallons, almost twice the original RFS level. For corn ethanol, EPA took into account the blend wall, but also the fact that the original congressional intent of the RFS was to pull into the market more biofuels than would have come into the market by market forces alone. My sense is that they made a reasonable compromise between conflicting issues and objectives. Next, I want to comment on greenhouse gas emission estimations. When biofuels are produced and consumed, greenhouse gases are released, and these must be measured and compared with fossil fuel emissions to determine the extent of emission reductions for each biofuel pathway. Agencies use some combination of attributional and consequential life cycle analysis to estimate these emissions. Economic models are used to estimate the market-mediated responses to the higher demand for the agricultural commodities. Possible responses include, to the higher commodity prices include reduced consumption, crop switching from one crop to another, converting forest or pasture to cropland, more intensive use of cropland, and changes in international trade and production. Consequential life cycle analysis is driven by market forces. Some have argued for an approach called additional carbon. The basic argument is crops grown for biofuels would have been grown anyway, so there's no additional carbon sequestered in producing the biofuel crops. Any crop used for biofuels just reduces use elsewhere in the economy. The empirical evidence, in my view, does not support this argument. For example, harvested corn area in the United States has increased roughly 10 million acres over the last 2 decades. Global harvested area of grains, cotton, and oilseeds has increased over 200 million acres between 2003 and 2012. In other words, there has been additional carbon taken from the atmosphere in producing these additional crops. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the California Air Resources Board, and the European Union all use some combination of attributional and consequential life cycle analysis to measure the greenhouse gas reductions of biofuels. None accept the additional carbon argument. Next, I want to comment on biofuel impacts on developing countries. The reasons for commodity price increases in 2008 and again in 2011 have been extensively researched. Most studies have concluded that biofuels did play a role, but not a predominant role in the price increases. To the extent that biofuels played a role in commodity price increases, it's clear that urban consumers in developing countries are adversely affected. But there's another side of the story, and that is that rural areas and farmers in developing countries can be made better off by those higher prices. The World Bank says 70% of the world's poor live in rural areas in developing countries and derive their primary livelihood from agriculture. To the extent that these higher prices are transmitted to rural areas, farmers and other rural residents can be made better off as their incomes increase. Last, some comments on the road to the future. The scientific community has concluded that climate change is real and is caused by human intervention. Most economists believe that the most efficient way to deal with the adverse impacts of climate change is through pricing emissions, through a market mechanism with a carbon tax. But Washington so far prefers a regulatory approach. So we have CAFE standards for fuel economy, the Clean Power Plan for electricity, and the Renewable Fuel Standard for reducing automotive emissions. Absent a market-based approach, I think the Renewable Fuel Standard and the other regulations are an appropriate and effective means to move our economy towards lower greenhouse gas emissions.
I thank the gentleman, and now our last witness, Mr. Loris, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Gosar, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Lawrence, Ranking Member Cartwright, and distinguished members of the subcommittees, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the Renewable Fuel Standard. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek famously wrote that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. Truer words could not be spoken about the Renewable Fuel Standard. The policy reveals the inability of the federal government to centrally plan energy markets and the unintended consequences it creates when doing so. The quota concentrates benefits to a select few and disperses the costs amongst the rest of us. Even within the agricultural community, the RFS rewards special interests connected to the policy and adversely impacts much of rural America. No matter how brilliant or well-informed, politicians cannot predict the future of energy markets. And even though the EPA can adjust the biofuel targets, the blend wall concerns, and Congress grossly overpredicting the commercial viability of cellulosic ethanol demonstrates why the government shouldn't set production quotas in the first place. And the RFS is far from the only mechanism the government has used to prop up the biofuels market. We've spent billions on targeted tax credits, imposed tariffs on imported ethanol, provided loan guarantees to cellulosic ethanol plants, and continue to spend taxpayer dollars on biofuel infrastructure and attempting to commercialize advanced biofuels. The RFS and these complementary subsidies have not contributed to meaningful reductions in oil supply or oil consumption. However, the mandate's cost to Americans is substantial, as we pay tens of billions of dollars more in higher food and gas prices each year. These higher prices hurt low-income families both here and abroad the most. These are the citizens that spend a disproportionately higher percentage of their budget on these goods. The mandate distorts commodity production and prices and takes land away from competing crops. About 40% of America's corn crop goes to ethanol for fuel. In 2012, the amount of corn used to produce ethanol in the U.S. exceeded the consumption of the entire continent of Africa and every single country with the exception of China. Biodiesel generated from soybeans presents the same food for fuel problem. In 2004, the year before Congress first created RFS, less than 1% of the soybean crop was used for biodiesel. By 2014, that figure jumped to 23%. Consequently, the diversion of crops to fuel raises the input prices for livestock producers. In total, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that Americans spend $3.5 billion more per year at the grocery store because of this mandate. Research from several universities finds the cost to be significantly higher. Whatever the most accurate estimate is, the direction is always the same. We pay more. The RFS drives up prices at the pump as well. Americans are paying $10 billion more annually to blend ethanol into our gasoline. According to DOE and EPA's own website, a motorist could spend an additional $450 per year to run a flex fuel vehicle on E85 compared to a regular gasoline blended with E10. And the RFS has unintended environmental impacts. Even the EPA acknowledges that increases in soybean production as a result of the mandate can cause adverse effects to water quality, ecosystems, and habitats while increasing criterion pollutants like sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide. Furthermore, the alleged climate benefit from the RFS is dubious at best. Even under the assumption that switching from oil to biofuels significantly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, which is a very generous assumption, the impact on global temperatures would be negligible. But the real problem with the RFS is not the use of biofuels themselves. Rather, it is Washington deciding what goes in our gas tanks. Ethanol would likely exist in a world without the mandate, though clearly not in as great of quantities. But that should be for the market to determine. Collectively, Americans spend hundreds of billions of dollars on gasoline each year. Globally, the transportation fuels market is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. Any alternative energy source won't need a government program mandating its production and consumption. The profit incentive reward cost-competitive fuels. Broadly speaking, the RFS provides valuable lessons about the problems when the federal government intervenes in energy markets. Bad policies that award preferential treatment remain in place or are expanded because of the supposed political importance trumps economic viability. Even former Vice President Al Gore admitted that he supported the corn ethanol mandate because he had a strong incentive to please his constituents in Tennessee and the farmers in Iowa. It was only until after he stopped running for office that he could call first-generation biofuels a mistake. The RFS, and all other energy subsidies for that matter, create a vicious loop of politicians, lobbyists, and special interests protecting these policies and determining who produces what. The most effective solution to this problem is to eliminate the preferential treatment altogether. In conclusion, Congress should recognize the entire mandate as a failure, and the government has no legitimate role in propping up one energy source over another. The only viable reform is to repeal RFS in its entirety. And Congress should do so as part of fundamental reform that eliminates subsidies for all energy sources. Such reforms will empower the private sector and innovative companies to drive fuel competition and choice. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank the gentleman. The chair notes the presence today of our fellow OGR member, Mr. Welsh. We appreciate your interest in this topic and welcome your full participation in the hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I'd like to first recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grundler, I have 3 different ethanol producers in my district. One of them tells me that the RFS is a ceiling, and the other one tells me the RFS is a floor. And I have received so much conflicting information on this. I have a few, I think, fairly straightforward questions for you. When does the RFS expire? You mentioned 2022. Is that the date that people agree on that the RFS expires?
The RFS does not expire.
Okay. Well, what you mentioned 2022. What happens in 2022?
In 2022, the statutory mandates, the specified volumes that Congress put in the law, and EPA is required to, after 2022, establish what the appropriate volume should be.
When does the market kick in? When does a consumer get the chance to say, I want E85, I want E10, I want E0?
The consumer has that choice today, sir.
We don't have to have E10 in our car?
I'm sorry, the consumer has a choice of using all of those fuels. With respect to E10, the refining industry and the transportation fuels of this industry have been using ethanol as a octane enhancer, as a volume extender for many, many years.
So many of us believe the RFS is a failure because we have standards that are arbitrarily set and somehow the marketplace is supposed to react. Why is EPA in any better position in 2022 to do something that Congress failed to do properly up until 2022?
Well, the Congress did give the administrator a long list of factors to consider for what those future standards or volumes should be comprised of, including the environmental impacts, the impacts on energy security, impacts on cost to consumers, the impacts on agriculture, the impacts on transportation.
So let me ask you this. There are blender pumps going in all across America right now, and blender pumps give individual consumers the ability to make choices between whatever level, actually whatever level the law allows, but hopefully someday whatever level they choose. Isn't that a better way to determine ethanol consumption in this country than to have either Congress or the EPA make that decision for consumers?
Well, sir, our job that you directed us to do is to implement this law as
I actually asked you for an opinion and not what the law was this time. Wouldn't that be a better way, given our marketplace in America, to allow consumers to make those choices?
Sir, I'm not here to provide an opinion or or advice on how to change the law. I'm representing the agency, and we do not have a position on that.
Under the system as it's currently set up, does a refiner pay an ethanol producer if the refiner doesn't use a certain amount of ethanol each year?
No, the refiner buys. The refiner actually has a choice to either buy the ethanol, and along with that comes a credit, which is used to measure compliance, or the refiner can go to the marketplace and buy a credit. It's called a renewable, a RIN.
Who gets the money from that RIN?
Who gets the money from that RIN? Whoever the refiner is buying it. He could be buying it from another refiner. It could be it's a marketplace. These are private transactions.
Ms. Stone, I have a question for you. To sort of summarize your testimony, you indicated that the ethanol production raises food prices. And I understand that there are other factors. There's water use and chemical use and other things. But is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Okay. So and that demand for ethanol drives up food prices.
Yes.
Is there any other demand out there that you would like to manipulate to drive down prices? And I paid a lot for my iPhone. I'm just wondering if you could help me. Could we drive down demand for iPhones? And my car was really expensive also. Are there things that we could do to reduce the price of other things? And perhaps not just blame farmers who are making more money as a result of ethanol being used, but we could blame high-tech companies, we could blame all kinds of producers in this country for the cost and the benefit that they receive.
I appreciate the Congressman's question because I do want to be very clear that I in no way hold American farmers responsible for the impacts of the RFS. They are quite rightfully responding to a market that Congress has created. But what I am saying is that this energy policy is having detrimental impacts on the most vulnerable and poorest in the world, and that it's also not achieving the goals that Congress set out for it initially. And so that it's time to move away from food-based biofuels.
I thank the chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Supporters of the RFS point to its success. For instance, according to the biotechnology industry, the RF has displaced nearly 1.9 billion barrels of fuel. Mr. Is it Grundler?
Grundler.
Grundler. I understand that the EPA recognizes that currently market limitations are limitations to the increased use of higher ethanol content fuels, including current market. It's near terms limits on fueling infrastructure. What assurances can you provide to this committee that the new rules, as well as the future rules, will not cripple the RFS program's ability to encourage infrastructure investments?
Thank you, ma'am. The final standards we put in place by no means cripple this industry or its future. I'm not in a position to speculate what 2017 or 2018 or 2019 standards will be. That will be up to the administrator. We're doing the analysis right now for the 2017 volumes. But the trends are going up. We foresee steady growth in these fuels as competition increases and as more facilities come online to produce these advanced fuels.
Ms. Stone, you urged the committee to support reforming RFS, is that correct?
That's correct.
So give us some suggestions. What would you like to offer to reform it?
What Action Aid USA would like to see moving forward with the RFS is an end to food-based biofuel mandates because of the reasons I outlined in my statement. They aren't working for the environment, but they are harming people. We would also like to see sustainability measures in place, both social and environmental, to ensure that land use does not compete with food production globally.
Okay.
And that's also part of the reason that we have supported removing, at least at first, the corn ethanol mandate as a good first step.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, in your prepared testimony, you stated that the RFS has achieved its stated objectives. Do you believe that the RFS rules announced in 2015 will help to restore confidence within the biotechnology industry to make sure new infrastructure investments in the renewable fuel industry?
Thank you. Yes, in general, I think that's correct. We have to recognize that the corn ethanol industry is a mature industry. It's already reached the capacity to produce at the RFS level. It's not going to grow beyond where it is, very much at least. The framework that EPA is using for cellulosic biofuels, basically build it and we will come, does create the incentive structure for new companies to enter and come into the business. And the same is true with biodiesel.
My last question to Dr. Grundler, correct? I understand that both the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and Energy have programs supporting biofuels and biofuels infrastructure, and that you work closely with these agencies to implement the statute. Can you elaborate on what specific programs you collaborated with the Department of Ag and Energy to support the biofuels and the biofuel infrastructure?
Yes, the primary cooperation is in setting these annual fuel volumes. We rely on expert advice with respect to future gasoline demand and what the potential is for the market to respond to different scenarios of volumes. We also work very closely with experts across these two agencies with respect to new biofuel pathways, what are the right assumptions we should be making about ag inputs into our modeling and so on. So it's a very close relationship. The Energy Department also sponsors quite a bit of research into advanced second-generation biofuels.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, Mr. Loris, tell me what part of this story I got wrong. A few years ago, politicians get together and they decide they're going to determine what levels of ethanol should be put into the market and should be mandated usage by the American consumer. They did this for a number of energy sources. We had the Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program, where they gave all kinds of money, billions of dollars, to 28 different companies. 22 had a credit rating of BB-. A bunch of them went bankrupt, companies like Beacon Power and Solyndra. This year in the ethanol program, the mandated schedule that all these smart politicians decided on a few years ago that they were smarter than the market is now going to hit the blend wall, which means it can't really work. And that's not your conclusion or even Dr. DeCicco's conclusion. That's the EPA's conclusion, as evidenced by the testimony Mr. Grundler gave just a few years ago. Now, the EPA can change, they can waive the level. They have to set, actually there's a notice time, right? They have to notice each year what level it's going to be. And in the 8 years this law has been in place, they've only hit that date, they've only complied with the law 3 times out of 8 years, right? So even though they can change, they couldn't figure it out, they couldn't even tell us at the appropriate time schedule that the law lays out. And this year, when they did tell us what level they were going to use, they said, well, we're also going to tell you what level we were going to use in 13 and 14. So they went back retroactively. It's hard to tell you what you're going to use when you've already used it, right? You can't change the past, but that's what they did in November of 2015. And then to add insult to injury, as Dr. DeCicco pointed out, all this actually increases greenhouse gases. Now, I mean, this would be like a comedy, right? You couldn't make a movie. Sometimes fact is actually stranger than fiction. And the clincher is this, because Mr. Grundler just answering Mr. Buck's question, in 2022, EPA is completely in control, right? They only 3 times in 8 years could they actually tell us what the level is. Now the level is going to be too much for the market to even won't work. But now in 2022, they're completely in charge. Now, what part of that story do I got wrong?
None of it. In fact, after your opening statement, I was just going to say ditto and forego my opening remarks, because you're spot on. And again, this speaks to the government trying to force technologies into the market. Even when gas prices were high, were $4 a gallon, these fuels couldn't compete with oil. When gas prices are consistently high in Europe, you don't see biofuels overtaking those markets. So as much as the federal government wants to try and force alternative technologies into the market, they're just not cost competitive, and it's cost us as taxpayers, as energy consumers, and with this policy, as food consumers.
Yeah, so what's going to happen in 2022 when the EP is totally running the show? They can decide the number, they can decide when they're going to tell us, what's going to happen?
That's a great question, and ostensibly, whoever is in control of the administration at that point is going to continue to tell the EPA to ramp up those targets, and which makes the opportunities to repeal the failed program now all that much more important.
Dr. DeCicco, you want to add anything?
I very much agree. Clearly, Dr. Tyner and myself have a difference of perspective on the success of this policy. You know, I wouldn't call it a comedy as much as I'd call it a tragedy. You know, I think in many ways there were some good intentions. I mean, after all, when ISA was passed, I don't remember the vote in this chamber, but it went through the Senate 86-8. A lot of people felt that that policy was going to be beneficial for a variety of reasons. But this particular part of the policy, you know, as Dr. Tyner said, there's kind of a three-legged stool here, rural economic interest, or I would be more specific, certain rural economic interest, I think is well known. Not everybody in the agricultural sector is at all pleased with this policy. Certain parts of the sector do benefit from it, clearly, though. So you have a partial leg of that first leg on certain parts of the agricultural community. I think in energy security, the costs of this policy are enormous costs, both monetary and environmental, make it an extremely cost-effective way. Sure, it's displaced some oil, but just in the last 2 years, the expansion we've had, the market-driven expansion in domestic oil production due to technology advances that the oil and gas industry itself put into place, have put in more than 3 times the volume of fuel into the market than was forced in over the last 10 years by the RFS. So sure, it has displaced some oil, but the market has done a much better job of supplying our energy needs. When it comes to the environment, something like greenhouse gas emissions, that's an externality. Government intervention is required. The market's not going to fix that problem on its own, but that intervention needs to be very judicious. Much more thought needs to be given about how to address the part of emissions associated with petroleum fuel use. As I said, the types of analyses on which, as Dr. Tyner points out, everyone has relied. I don't disagree that all the agencies here and abroad have been using life cycle analysis for this. My academic work shows that that method is inherently flawed, and I think we need to go back to the drawing board on that score, because one of the things I want to take issue with, you know, Wally said that this analysis is used to measure. It doesn't measure, it models. These are computer simulations, computer scenarios. They're not like taking a gallon of fuel and you can measure how much sulfur or lead are in that fuel through chemical analysis. That's not what's going on here. It's not measurement, it's computer modeling, and unfortunately, in spite of good intentions, the models are just plain wrong.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I now acknowledge my colleague, Mr. Cartwright from Pennsylvania. By the way, the current score is 5-0, law over low.
Cellulosic is the correct pronunciation.
Still got 0.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you know what, Dr. DeCicco, I wanted to open up with you. I said in my opening statement, and I kind of parroted something that I got from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, and that was this: over its 10-year lifespan, the Renewable Fuel Standard has reduced U.S. transportation-related carbon emissions by 589.33 million metric tons. And that really just begs the question that you're raising, because I see that that was done using a GREET 1 2013 model, which is a form of life cycle analysis that you're criticizing. Have I stated that correctly?
That's correct.
Okay. And you've also gone so far as to say just now that the life cycle analysis is the one generally employed by the Department of Energy, by the EPA, et cetera, correct?
That's right.
That's sort of the conventional wisdom.
It is.
And you're bucking that, and you're doing that based on your own research over how many years?
Well, you know, true confession here.
We're looking for the truth.
Over 20,
generally.
right? That's right. Over 20 years ago, at an earlier stage of my looking at transportation, energy use, and emissions, I wrote the first paper, co-authored with a professor at Dartmouth, that called for the use of life cycle analysis to assess the emissions from transportation fuels, including biofuels. We were taken with the technique at the time. It was developed in the late 80s.
So it's not completely crazy.
So it seemed to make sense at a certain level, and I went along with that. About 10 years ago, actually, before ISA was passed, I began questioning
Dr. DeChico,
that.
Unfortunately, I only have 5 minutes,
Okay.
so we can't make short stories long around here.
Okay, well, the basic point is I've been thinking and analyzing these issues very deeply for 25 years.
And please forgive me for asking this question, but it's something that we do around here. May I ask who's been funding your research?
Sure. I do have currently a one-year grant from the American Petroleum Institute on this. They are not the only funder. The core work.
And let me interrupt
Sure.
you for a moment there. Is it a matter of complete indifference to you whether the American Petroleum Institute continues to fund your research into the future?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And my position on this issue, in fact, my position against the RFS predates by a good number of years funding from the American Petroleum Institute.
Thank you, sir. Now, Mr. Grundler, on behalf of the EPA, can you address from an environmental perspective why EPA encourages the production and use of ethanol and biomass-based diesel by including them in the RFS?
Thank you, sir. Our job is to administer the statute that Congress has written, and it is the Congress who has established the goals in the law and set these very ambitious levels of advanced and total renewable fuel. Congress did not establish an ethanol standard. Congress established a total and an advanced standard and a cellulosic standard and a biomass-based diesel standard. I'd also just like to point out that Congress also directed EPA to utilize life cycle analysis to understand land use impacts, both direct and indirect, from the increased use of biofuels.
Very good. Thank you for that, Mr. Grundler. And Dr. Tyner, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on this. Using the GREET 1 2013 life cycle analysis, in your view, is that appropriate?
GREET is a model that it's called an attributional analysis. It measures the direct emissions. It does not take into account the land use change emissions. So it is the state of the art for measuring direct emissions.
Well, I thank you for that. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses for appearing today. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We're still 5-0. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses here today. My questions would be directed initially to Dr. Tyner. We've heard today that 1.9 billion barrels of equivalent fuel has been produced over the last 10 years with these biofuels, cellulosic or losic, whatever it might be. When we look at the annual consumption of fuel and barrel production, we consume about 7 billion barrels a year. So in other words, 1.9 billion, while that sounds like an extraordinarily large number, is actually 13 weeks over a decade. So that will be kind of the frame up. After a decade, we've produced 13 weeks of fuel. My question, sir, is can you make plastic out of corn?
I'm not a plastic corn scientist, but I have read that it can be done, yes.
Okay. Can you make asphalt out of corn?
I do not know.
Can you make rubber out of corn?
I do not know.
Can you make frames for computer chips out of corn?
I do not know.
Okay. How much ethanol-based fuel is used for jet fuel?
None.
Oh, I see. Did you know that there's 25% less BTUs in ethanol as opposed to petroleum-based fuel?
It's actually 33, sir.
Okay, I'll take your word on that. But do you also acknowledge that there's a higher smog effect also on the production of ethanol?
My understanding of the analyses that have been done on that is that it depends on the study that was done and time of year it was done. So it's still uncertain, I think.
Well, it wasn't uncertain in the 1995 Third Circuit Court of Appeals in the ATI versus the EPA. It might be worth noting that. Did you know that it takes 50 acres of corn for a gallon of ethanol to be produced?
It's not true.
It's not true. Oh, I see. Or 75 gallons of water per gallon of ethanol?
I don't know the water metric.
So I guess, for all of that and all of our lifestyle that we enjoy as Americans and, the not taking into account the farm implements, the labor, the water, the use of food supply, the impact on our defense, the fact that we wouldn't have water bottles, cell phones, computers, computer chips, synthetic clothing, roads. I can go on. We can look around this room and identify practically everything that has some basis to our quality of life. Are you still of the firm belief that we need to eliminate petroleum with biofuel?
I never said that we should eliminate petroleum with biofuel, and in fact, it's impossible to eliminate petroleum with biofuel.
So now it gets back to one of efficiency and what's best for the environment. Do you think consuming the world's food supply and putting it in the gas tank is good for human beings?
I think that we have an obligation to our children and our grandchildren to reduce greenhouse gases.
We have an obligation to feed them as well.
And we're doing a good job of it. Yeah. The United States has the most productive agricultural system in the world. American consumers eat for less than 10% of their disposable income, the lowest in the world. We're doing a very effective job of producing both food and fuel.
And wouldn't it be great if we could send those corn sacks, gift from the United States of America, maybe to people who aren't as productive as we are? Now, you made a bold statement at the beginning of your testimony where you said that all of these biofuels have reduced imports on petroleum. What basis do you mount that on? 13 weeks of production?
I didn't say how large the increase was, sir. I said that there was a reduction in imports.
So shale energy revolution had nothing to do with the reduction in imports?
We've studied shale oil and gas, and we've estimated the economic benefit for the country, and it is huge.
It is a huge impact to have shale oil revolution, and it also bolstered our economy. I would suggest to you, sir, that the American way of life, the material good that we do to the entire world, the ability to fight disease, the ability to make pharmaceuticals from petroleum, there are so many good things. And I just, Mr. Chairman, appreciate us having this committee hearing today. I think we need to take a realistic look at all of the good that we provide the world, and we're not doing a bad job with the oil and gas industry. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Dunsanier from California. Be next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Tyner, I'm struggling with coming from California, and many years ago when I was a Republican, I was actually appointed by Governor Wilson to the California Air Resources Board. And as we developed a low-carbon fuel standard, along with our renewable standards, and having 4 refineries in my district, I have a good relationship with the petroleum industry. So I'm trying to figure out, and having been in many meetings about the low-carbon fuel standard, in California, although we've had issues, particularly with the refining process, we're getting huge investment. We've had lots of venture capitals come and say they're coming at the Berkeley laboratory. I've been down a few times to look at the synthetic biofuels that they're developing, which they tell me they're through the DOE interventions and support. They're really on the cusp of being able to do some really significant things which would help to cause some of the criticisms about both this program but the low-carbon fuel standard. So from my perspective, although there have been challenges to this kind of process, both the carrot and the stick, that it's worth continuing to work on, knowing that it's not perfect in the first place. So first of all, are you familiar with some of our struggles in California? And by the way, the low-carbon fuel standard was signed into law by a Republican governor, Governor Schwarzenegger. So all of our hearings anticipated much of the conversation here today. It's different because we were looking at carbon reductions, which I think at the Air Resources Board, when we did our best work, irrespective of whether it was a Republican administration, it was driven on what you got reductions, either in traditional pollutants. This is a different approach, but it's sort of the same thing. So maybe help me with trying to understand. We're being pretty successful in California, and this is a process that's not dissimilar, and I'm trying to struggle with what are the things we've already lived through that we could sort of apply to the renewable standard nationally.
Well, the California low-carbon fuel standard gives credit for every reduction.
Right.
And that's different from the U.S. Renewable fuel standard. The renewable fuel standard sets thresholds, 20% for corn ethanol, 50% for biodiesel, 60% for cellulosic biofuels. So if you get 80%, you get no more credit. If you get 30% for corn, you get no more credit. In California, you get credit for every percentage reduction that your fuel achieves. So it's, again, a more market-oriented system that, and we've worked with the California Air Resources Board. We've worked with them in getting the induced land use change estimates that go into their standard. It's a standard that's being considered by other states around the country, as you probably know. Its advantage is that it does give credit for all the reductions achieved and not just surmounting a threshold.
But it's more market-based.
It's market-based.
Than doing so.
Right.
In the context of that, it was an evolution, and I'm like all of us, parochial in my own experience. But we did learn from going through these, including the drivability index. When we talk to the car manufacturers, we want to be able to pass the standards so that the fuel doesn't constrain or inhibit the sale of automobiles and their drivability. So it strikes me in the context of this hearing, and again, from my perspective, this is an iterative process, and why wouldn't we continue? And maybe, Mr. Grundler, you could put your 2 cents worth in, is that this law needs to be modified, but how can we learn from other experiences, both in the states and around the world, to make it work better, including for the marketplace?
My office works very, very closely with the California Air Resources Board across a wide variety of different work, trucks, cars, lawnmowers, fuels. We're very familiar with the California low-carbon fuel standard. It is a very different approach in that it is a performance standard-based approach, whereas the Congress chose to decide very specific volume targets every year, which change over time, and as Dr. Tyner mentioned, has these thresholds. I think we are learning a lot from the California experience, and there have been some bumps along the road, but I think by and large it's been successful for some of the reasons that Dr. Tyner suggested. But it is very different from the law as Congress wrote it, and I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I'll just leave it at this as well. It's not, and I apologize for showing my prejudice over California, not if anybody's watching at home, but It seems to me that this is a process, and I agree with my Republican colleagues that we should probably look at it and revisit it to make it work better, including for the marketplace. But there are other iterations around the country and the world that seem to be working through, so maybe less prescriptive and more market-based, but with the ultimate goal being the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'd like to acknowledge now my gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grunler, why have the EPA's estimates of cellulosic ethanol production been so poor? I mean, if you go from 2010, 2011, just way off the base. So why is that?
Thank you for that question. We work very closely with individual producers, individual plants, to having made those estimates over the past few years, and we relied on estimates that we got directly from the producers and what their schedules were and what their production volumes were, and it turned out that those producers and that information that they provided us was too optimistic. We've changed.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's difficult to centrally plan this stuff. Now, you revised the definition, and now in 2014, there was 140 million cellulosic biofuel RINs generated. However, Congress had mandated 3 billion gallons. So is there any way that, does EPA believe there's any way that they'll be able to generate the billions that are called for?
Not between now and the end of 2016.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. Dr. DeSico, when this was created, the environment was one of the main things, and so it causes problems with food, energy price, all that. But it's like, hey, you're going to get environmental benefit. But I think you make an effective case. I mean, it's actually not good for the environment, is it?
That's correct. The environmental premises of this have turned out to be incorrect.
And Ms. Stone, you point out, I think very correctly, that when you're raising food prices artificially, that has an effect. Someone, a blue-collar person in America, they're going to have to stretch their family budget. But you point out some of these people around the world, if food prices go up, I don't know, 5–10%, what does that mean for someone in a really destitute part of the world?
It's a significant impact. In sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, people spend, as I said, between 60 and 80% of their income on food. And so even small increases can mean that they don't have enough to feed their families. And I also want to emphasize what that really means. Children who do not receive enough nutritious food before their second birthday can be permanently physically and mentally stunted.
Well, Dr. Tyner pointed out, hey, in some of these poor areas, you may have people who are in agriculture, and they may benefit from this. And let's just assume that's true. In your experience, what's the number of people that would benefit from producing versus the number of consumers who would be harmed? I mean, it seems like you're harming way, way, way more poor people than you're helping poor farmers, correct?
Yes, and in our experience, if prices of inputs go up for these smallholder farmers, then that outweighs any cost benefits they may receive. But also, many of these farmers are sustenance farmers. They eat most of what they grow.
Mr. Loris, the price that people pay at the pump is higher as a result of the ethanol mandate, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so, you're getting hit environmentally, you're getting hit at the grocery store, you're getting hit there. The quality of the gasoline, though, is also, I think, something interesting. What is your opinion on whether the fuel with the ethanol in it is better for car and boat engines than the purer blend?
Yeah, well, we've seen obvious failures with some of these smaller engines with boats. If they can bear higher ethanol content, then that's fine. But we shouldn't try to rush and increase the allowable content of ethanol because of this blend wall or because we're trying to force more biofuels in the market. That's another unintended consequence of this mandate.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody that represents a lot of coastline, our boaters, our fishermen, it hurts their engines. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. So that imposes cost on them if they have to replace it or do repairs. Look, I think the proper solution is just recognize that this policy was a mistake. Let's repeal the mandate. But here's the thing. Let's repeal all of these energy mandates. We'll do solar, oil, gas, ethanol, everything, and let's actually let people compete in the marketplace. Let's give relief to consumers. Let's get out of this business of where people in Washington are picking winners and losers, dictating from on high. We don't even do a good job of it, and let's let people make the decisions. But I would be fine getting rid of all of this in the energy market, and let's just return to a free market. I think ultimately that will be better for consumers. I think it'll ultimately be better for the environment because I think it'll allow innovation to really take hold. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now acknowledge Mr. Walker from North Carolina.
I want to pick up from where Congressman DeSantis left off. I want to come back to you, Mr. Loris. Two-part question. With the RFS, it did not lower the fuel prices from 2010 to 2012. I'd like for you to explain why you believe that is, and then after 2013, why it's been effective as far as reducing oil prices there. Would you mind addressing both of those?
Sure. Well, the fact that ethanol is less energy dense contributes to higher prices. You have to pay more to drive the same amount effectively. So that's contributing to the higher fuel prices that we pay at the pump. And again, this ripples throughout the economy. This is something that when you pay more at the pump, you can't have disposable income in other parts of the economy. So this has tremendous ripple effects that hits consumers again and again.
Sure. Ms. Stone, again, what we were just talking about as far as poverty and some of the needs. I've worked in some of the refugee camps in Europe and I've seen it firsthand. In your testimony, you described some of the more unfamiliar effects of RFS. Could you explain the effects on the efforts to combat hunger? I know you just mentioned it, but could you get a little bit more background?
I'm sorry, on the effects to combat how the RFS is impacting hunger broadly?
Correct.
So one of the things that, in addition to food price, as I mentioned earlier, many poor people in the developing world are sustenance farmers, and they rely on land and having secure ownership of that land to grow that food. Biofuels mandates for food-based biofuels incentivize large plantations of one crop of biofuels. And so what happens is these small family farmers are forced off of their land to make way for these large plantations. And so that directly impacts their ability to grow food for themselves and their family, but also the community at large.
Would you say that's the same, or could you expand a little bit when it comes to clean drinking water?
Yes, when it comes to drinking water, it does depend on the type of biofuel feedstock, but what we have found is that expanding biofuel production requires more water. And so less water is available to the community to grow their own food. It also means that there's less available for them to use for other basic needs, such as drinking and hygiene.
Mr. DeCiso, I've got a lengthy question here, about 4 or 5 lines, but I want to get it out to you before my time expires. In your testimony, you state that corn ethanol life cycle analysis claiming a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to gasoline was not accurate. Rather, your research found that corn ethanol results in no significant reduction of emissions. Can you take a minute and elaborate on that? Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, that's correct. The basic principle to look about this correctly is to realize that when biofuels are burned in a car, that has very little effect on how much carbon dioxide comes out of the tailpipe. That's just basic chemistry. You burn a liquid fuel, you get about the same amount of CO2 from the tailpipe per unit of useful energy. My shorthand way to have people remember that is that if biofuels have a benefit for climate, it's not when they're burned. So you can set that aside. Say, okay, the action isn't happening at the car. In oil industry parlance, any potential benefit is not happening downstream. So you have to ask the question, okay, if there is a net reduction of carbon in the atmosphere, where might that happen? And the only place that can happen is on the land where feedstocks are grown. If a cornfield this year is growing corn that's being used for the food and feed market, it's removing a certain amount of carbon from the air. Okay. Now, if you take that corn harvest and the next year shift it to make ethanol, other things being equal, that cornfield hasn't pulled more carbon out of the air. So you say, where's the benefit?
Yeah.
If there is a benefit, you can only find it with Mr. Tyner's models that try to look at these commodity shifts all around the world. That introduces very large uncertainties. But at the other end of that chain, there's also some deforestation. Sure. So the bottom line is there is no direct emissions benefit within the United States.
Well, it's amazing when common sense and science kind of fuses together like that. I have one question. Dr. Tyner, do you refute the testimony of Dr. Ciciso, Mrs. Stone, Mr. Loris? Do you disagree with that? And I guess if you want to expound on that as my time expires here, even with the right intentions, do you believe these programs are now flawed?
I do disagree with them. I think that there are greenhouse gas emission savings. I think the land grab and things like that have not been largely attributable to biofuels. I've worked in 15 different developing countries, and I've never seen that kind of action in the 15 countries that I've worked in. So I think there are greenhouse gas emission savings. I think it's about greenhouse gas emissions. I think there have been food price increases, and that has adversely affected urban consumers, as I said, but they've also been positive implications. We've seen substantial supply response in the developing world, in sub-Saharan Africa and in South America, where poor farmers in those regions are growing more crops and getting higher incomes. There's two sides to that story. There's the urban side and the rural side, and we have to look at both sides.
I thank the gentleman. I now acknowledge the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. I want to change the subject for just a second, or not the subject, but kind of the focus. We've been focused on automobiles, we've been focused on the agriculture part of it, but I represent the coast of Georgia. I represent over 100 miles of coastal area in Georgia. Therefore, as you can imagine, boating is very popular in my district, and as one who grew up in the district, I've spent a lot of my life on the water. And let me start with you, Mr. Loris, and ask you, you're aware, Mr. Loris, of the unique challenges that ethanol-blended fuels can present to marine engines, particularly overheating and engine failure, correct?
Absolutely.
So you're also aware that while some of the marine engines that are on the market today, that they can utilize the E10 fuel, but if you get above that, I'm not aware of any that would be able to utilize a blend more than E10.
None that I know of.
So there's a risk that's associated, and I hope you all understand where I'm coming from. There's a very serious risk that's associated with using fuels with ethanol in marine engines, and particularly outboard engines, which a lot of people have, outboard engines, even up here, but particularly on the coast of Georgia, particularly when you're talking about being out in the ocean. And, you know, when you're in a boat and you have engine trouble, it's different than when you're in a car and you have engine trouble. I mean, when you're stranded out in the water and you have engine trouble, the weather can change suddenly. A number of things can happen. It's a serious, serious problem. And this is what we're running into here. So this is where my focus is at right now, is the impact the real impact that this is having on marine engines. And it's having that impact now. We're having overheating, we're having engine failure as a result of having to use this fuel. Mr. Grunler, would you agree that the EPA is bound by the renewable fuel standards to keep increasing the amount of ethanol that's in our fuel stocks?
I would disagree with that, sir.
You would disagree that the EPA is bound to increase? Do you think that the EPA is going to be attempting to increase the amount?
The job that Congress gave us was to increase the total amount of renewable fuels. The marketplace will choose.
That's not what I asked you. What I asked you was specifically, do you think that EPA is going to continue to attempt to increase the amount of ethanol in our fuels?
It's not a question of ethanol. We do not set an ethanol standard, sir.
Then that's what we've talked about all day, is the fact that the renewable fuel standards, that you're going to continually try to increase that. Now, I want you to understand what a dire strait this is going to put
marine engines in, and particularly people who utilize outboard engines, and the impact that this is going to have.
No,
If we continue to breach the blend wall, and it's no longer economically feasible for producers to use the RINs that you referred to earlier in this testimony, then we're not going to have any more ethanol-free fuel. And boaters are just going to simply be out of luck here. They're not going to be able to use their outboard engines, and if they do, they're going to be in the danger of being broke down out on the water. This is a serious, serious threat. So this is more than just the economic impact. Obviously, we all understand the economic impact this is going to have, but this is putting people's safety at risk here.
I'm very sensitive to those concerns, sir. I come from Michigan. We do a lot of boating. I'm a boater. I'm aware of the risk of using high ethanol blends in outboard motors. That's not permitted. All boat engines today are designed and calibrated to use E10. And as we consider these standards, we do look at what the marine environment needs and what the marine market needs for a lower ethanol blend.
Well, you know, as you move forward, I hope that you will keep in mind that you have an impact. When you increase this, you impact the marketplace. I mean, the producers are not going to continue to produce the ethanol-free fuels if there's not a market for it, if they are being required to produce the blended fuels. And this is going to have a big impact on boaters all across the country, whether it be in Michigan or especially whether it be on the coast of Georgia. And this is of concern to me because, I reiterate, it's different when you get broke down in a boat than when you get broke down in a car. It's a big, big difference.
I completely get that. I've been stuck out in the middle of Lake Michigan.
Well, and you ought to be stuck out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, I've been there too, sir, but not stuck, fortunately. But
well, I have been, and I can tell you it's not a good feeling.
Thank goodness for the Coast Guard. But what I'd like to just point out is that the marketplace does have choices, and obligated parties can choose to blend biodiesel.
With all due respect, Mr. Grundler, you have an impact on it. The EPA and your rules and your regulations have a big impact on it, and I hope you keep that in consideration. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
I think it would only benefit you if you weren't in the Bermuda Triangle. That might be trouble for you. I'd like to acknowledge the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing. Mr. Grundler, I'd like to continue with you in a similar train of thought dealing with the likely breach of the blend wall. As you know, the EPA has approved E15 for vehicle manufacturers from 2001 to the present. However, most of the manufacturers are clear that they do not recommend E15 for the vast majority of vehicles. In fact, I've got a chart that I wanted to see if we could put up here that indicates just the number of vehicles that cannot use E15 versus those that can. And as you can see, there's just a handful, literally a handful of vehicles that could utilize E15. Certainly no vehicle that I have, according to this chart, could utilize E15. You also testified in front of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee in 2013 that the blend wall had been reached and that, according to your testimony, quote, it is not feasible for the system to absorb that much ethanol. Well, this fear certainly has become true now with the 2016 rule breaching that blend wall, and of course that raises concern. But here's the thing that I want to ask you specifically. The 2007 Energy Independence and Security does allow the EPA to have authority to waive the RFS requirements if, and this is a direct quote from the statute, if implementation of a requirement would severely harm the economy or environment of a state, a region, or the United States. Now, based on the chart that we just looked at and all these other things that have been discussed, how can it not be recognized that the 2016 rule is going to have a negative impact on the economy?
We have exercised the tools that Congress provided to adjust the numbers in the law substantially downward, but only to the extent that we thought was necessary. We put a lot of effort, and this is all described in the final rule. So while the final standards, we believe, do go above this blend wall, the marketplace will have choices on how to achieve those standards. We think they are achievable, but we think we've done it in a responsible way.
Well, according to the chart that we put up, you're going to create an enormous economic problem for the vast majority of vehicle owners in this country. Let me just ask you, Mr. Loris, a similar question, just to get your input. What would you consider would be the economic impact of breaching the blend wall?
It'll be significant, as we've seen in the past when we had the drought too. If these RIN prices are driven up, that just exacerbates all of the costs we talked about throughout this hearing in terms of higher prices. So not only will gas prices be more expensive, but you'll be paying more as these RIN prices increase, which we've seen in the past. And it speaks to the need to revise these standards and mandates down to zero. Getting rid of just the corn part of the mandate is a bad idea too, because you're getting rid of the most economically competitive part of the mandate. As Dr. Tyner pointed out, this is the most mature part of the industry. So if we just leave it up to the mandate for cellulosic ethanol, that's the stuff that has difficulty becoming commercially viable and is going to be very prohibitive in terms of cost to meet any potential targets that the EPA sets.
So say on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being extremely severe, what kind of impact would you rate the breaching of the blend wall?
I would say as high as a 10. You never know what the market will bear. Unfortunately, we've been blessed through the shale revolution to have lower gas prices, so that's tampered some of the effects of this, the adverse effects of this mandate. That said, if we continue to reach the blend wall, if refiners are fined for not meeting any type of cellulosic requirements, it gets worse and worse as the targets go higher and higher.
Back to you, Mr. Grundler. You testified last month at the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee that you indicated that there may be a shift of the point of obligation from the refiner to the blender. Do you intend to address this as part of the 2017 rule?
I believe you're referring to my boss's testimony in front of the Senate. We have received that as part of our comments to the rule we just finalized. A number of people have come in and suggested that we consider that. We decided that that is outside the scope of these annual rulemakings. We're considering it, but we believe such a major change in the regulation and in the law should not be part of this annual rulemaking process.
So you have no intention of addressing that question at all?
We are talking to people. We're analyzing the question. If we were to address it, it would be not through an annual RVO standard-setting process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted that you're having this hearing, and I really appreciate you waving me on. I've listened to the testimony that I was here for, which is quite a bit, read your comments, and I want to thank the witnesses for focusing on this. I just want to make a couple of comments. I think that the ethanol situation has been good for the corn farmers who produce ethanol, and I like farmers. I come from a dairy state. But it's an astonishing development where you had this market that was created by a tax subsidy, 54 cents a gallon, that's since been repealed, B, essentially a tariff barrier that kept out competition from Brazil, worth 45 cents a gallon, and then finally, a very unusual thing, a requirement by government that consumers purchase this product, the mandate. And it's a bit of a head-scratcher for me, and it developed with the best of intentions to try to use our agricultural sector, presumably to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. My view is that after we've seen this operate, as long as we have, it's time to acknowledge it's a well-intended flop. Environmentally, I think the evidence is pretty compelling that at least with respect to the U.S., I don't know about world markets, Dr.
Tyner, and all the modeling that you're talking about. It's really complicated, so it makes it tough to be compelling. But there's a lot of water inputs that go into it. There's a lot of energy inputs that go into it. And at the end of the day, the best evidence I've seen is that there's more greenhouse gas that's created rather than saved. And then secondly, this is good if you're a corn farmer. It's not good if you're a dairy farmer. You're paying higher feed costs. And one of the things that brought my attention to this was when I was traveling around northern Vermont, where we have a lot of dairy farmers, and they were getting hammered a few years ago with low dairy prices and high grain prices. And it's just beyond, I think, comprehension to argue that where 40% of the corn product is going into ethanol, that the mandate doesn't have an impact on prices, whatever the price of corn is, and that fluctuates. It was up to $8. It's down quite a bit from that now. And then the next thing, so you've got the environmental issue that's not been achieved, the goal. You've got the impact on farmers. You've got all our food, anybody who buys foods, whether it's going to a grocery store or going to a chain restaurant, those food costs are a good deal higher. I mean, studies I've seen say that our chains spend about $18,000 to $28,000 more per unit. And that's real money for the consumers. And then finally, Mr. Carter was talking about the small engines, and it's wrecking our chainsaws. And I'm kind of upset about that because I had a pretty good chainsaw until ethanol wrecked it. And so, you know, I was hearing from my farmers and it got me concerned. I was hearing from our consumers, it got me concerned. And when they wrecked my chainsaw, I had to get involved. And here I am. So my hope is that we'll be able to build on the foundation of the work of this committee. And I think Congress should have a debate on this. You know, there's the Goodlatte, Womack, Welch, Costa bill that would repeal the corn-based ethanol mandate. And let's have a debate and let's see what the will of the House is. So I thank all the witnesses. This was tremendous testimony. And those consequences on food insecure countries, I'm so glad you're bringing attention to that. It's a couple of $2 billion in Guatemala. They don't have money to throw around. So that's a tough aspect here, too. So would this be one of those strange convergences of Democrats and Republicans, Mr. Gosar, it takes you to bring us together on?
You know what? Whatever harmonics it takes. I just got one question for you. What kind of chainsaw do you have?
I have a Johnson.
I was just going to say that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go last. Mr. Grundler, after 2022, the RFS mandates set by Congress in the EISA stop increasing and discretion of the program, with few limitations, is handed over to EPA. We are only now a few years away from this. What plans does the agency have to deal with this, and what has EPA come up with to manage this?
Sir, 2022 is quite a ways off.
Whoa, not really.
We've had a hard enough time setting standards, 1 year in the future. Setting them figuring out what the world is going to look like in 2022 is pretty challenging. So the honest answer is we have no plans on what the standards should look like post-2022. I would quibble with your characterization, though, that the Congress didn't provide us any direction on how to do so. You did. There's a long list of factors, and as well as deadlines associated with when we need to set those standards.
Well, I find it interesting that, in other committee hearings, we hear about this forecasting 5, 10 years out, and I'm a businessman, I'm a dentist impersonating a politician. So, I hear this forecasting, and yet I turn to your testimony, and yet we're not forecasting. So that's kind of odd to me. Dr. DeCiccio, you're not the average person, are you?
I'll leave that to others to judge.
No. Can you tell me a little bit? You were senior fellow for what?
Well, I was a senior fellow for automotive strategies at the Environmental Defense Fund from 2001 through 2009.
So you're an actual scientist?
I am, yes. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Tyner, are you a scientist?
I'm an economist.
So we're refereeing a match here on science that you're not the referee, he is, right?
It's not a referee on science, sir. It's a referee on market-mediated
No,
changes.
because you're talking about models. And in the science world, we take models and we compare them against facts to see, I mean, this is in my ballpark now, too. So we actually look at these modeling for outcomes, but then we come back to correct them based upon factual basis. Is that not true?
That's correct, and we do that all the time.
Well, I think economics, and I want to come back to the actual facts about what's happening on the ground. Dr. DeCicco, so when you come to this point, you've seen it from the very infancy of standards all the way to today. So you're very well-rounded. You don't have a bias one way or another. You've actually pinpointed this based on the facts, right?
That's correct.
So let me ask you another question. You know, I've seen some rumors. I mean, we've kind of hedged it here. When we have combustion of these alternative fuels, is there anything that that occurs that is alarming? That there's something else that it goes into combination that is a byproduct?
Well, combustion produces a variety of pollutants that we need to clean up. Those traditional pollutants were ones that caused smog, created fine particles, and EPA has done really an outstanding job over the years of tightening the standards, down so that those pollutants are, with the best vehicles now running on reformulated gasoline, have standards many orders of magnitude of what cars were, when we were kids.
Oh, I understand, but when we look at the combustion of these alternative fuels, some of the chemistry is not exactly good, is it?
Well, let me put it this way, it's more challenging. You take a fuel like ethanol, it has some combustion benefits. It has a very high octane fuel, but it has less energy per gallon.
Right.
So that's another issue. Environmentally speaking, there's no compelling reason, no reason to force an alternative fuel such as ethanol into the market to burn instead of gasoline. Reformulated gasoline today is an extremely clean fuel at the tailpipe. So yes, different fuels have different properties, but I think the main point is that there's no compelling environmental reason to put ethanol at the point of combustion. And again, there's no CO2 benefit at the point of combustion. So I'll leave it at that.
Sounds good. Well, I'm going to summarize. It's important for Congress and the administration to use a common sense approach when dealing with these biofuels. Congress shouldn't be in the business of helping some industries at the expense of others. Causing unnecessary harm to domestic shipping, agriculture, food production, and other industries that are affected by these regulations defies common sense. The RFS ultimately hurts American consumers by increasing prices and decreasing the quality of fuel used by American consumers and by the majority of gas-powered equipment across America. Ultimately, I am an adamant supporter of free market principles, and I am philosophically opposed to picking winners and losers in the American energy sectors. I will continue to fight for the repeal of RFS and for the production of market-based solutions in relation to biofuels. I also have biofuels from algae out in my world, out in Yuma, believe it or not. So, Mr. Grundler, one last question. You understand why so many people have a negative image of the EPA, and I'm going to leave you with this. Trust is a series of promises kept. Tell me why we should trust the EPA when we look at Flint, when we look at Durango, Colorado. Over and over again, we see distrust because we see an overreaching and overbearing agency. So go back and look in the mirror, and I hope that you'll come up with a whole different attitude because I'm looking forward to seeing your boss tomorrow. With that, with no further conversation or questions, I would like to thank the witnesses for taking time today to appear before us. If there is no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.